While I have studied the calendar a number of times before, as some of you know, I've recently been working to consider it more thoroughly and to consider alternative ideas about it over the past year. And I want to start talking about that. This will be a multi-part presentation. And to be clear, when I say calendar, I am specifically referring to days, weeks, months, and years, because there isn't actually a word used in the Torah text that just means calendar. So the calendar is actually a group of a number of different parts of Torah observance. We can all recognize that the calendar is an important topic because it relates to many commands which we want to do, or at least observe to the extent that we can in our current situation. And a calendar is essentially a requirement for any sort of cohesive community, which is clearly important for going into the future. We can also recognize that matters of the calendar are also very emotional topics. It is a very divisive subject, and aside from the messianic stuff, it is probably the number one thing to argue about and to keep people separated. If you look around social media discussions about the calendar or various website articles that supposedly prove a calendar view, you will usually see people just trying to beat each other over the head with a very emotional presentation of the verses they think are proof texts, or even just their personal logic about how the calendar needs to be. And that may not even be scriptural at all. And whenever it comes to discussing these matters, let's say there is a situation where two people are each genuinely wanting to get to the truth. Each person one and person two, each of them are wanting to see what the Torah actually says and try to piece together a calendar from that. Inevitably, in that situation, person one will think in his mind that person two is just not paying attention to the evidence. Person two is refusing to acknowledge what the text says. And person two will be thinking exactly the same thing, that person one is just not seeing what the text says and is ignoring the evidence. And what is typically going on is that both people are trying to pay attention to what the Torah says, but they have chosen different parts of it to focus on. And their evidence of choice is what they are filtering everything else in the text through. One person's evidence is another person's not so important passage that needs to be filtered through the reading of some other verse. The other verse that the other person thinks is the real evidence. People get the idea that they are the only ones paying attention to the text because they are the only ones treating that possible piece of evidence in that way. They are the only ones treating it as such a heavy piece. This inevitably generates a lot of frustration and a lack of willingness to continue discussing it or considering it. And you will also see presentations which treat a personal calendar view as so obvious, as if there should be no question whatsoever and no real need to investigate it, as if all of this question surrounding the calendar is without reason and as if everything is completely proven. And then whenever the rules of a supposedly obvious calendar are laid out and given a careful and thorough look, the reality is that they are often mostly non-textual. It is mostly based upon filling in the blanks or taking certain passages and treating them in a way which was probably not intended. While that may be understandable to do because we personally have to choose something based upon what the text says, on the other hand, when there is a need to fill in the blanks like that with things which are not from the text, it is clear that the calendar is not as obvious as one might portray it. That often leads to a calendar that may heavily rely on weak evidence and inference. It may heavily rely on symbolism. It may heavily rely on emotional appeals or just philosophical ideas. And as we know, there is a clear need or desire to have a clear calendar now. I think this need has motivated another type of approach, and that is the use of non-Torah books, which are probably not credible, because there is this understandable desire to have it all laid out now, and some of these non-Torah books do lay out some form of a calendar. And even outside of those books, this would also motivate the reliance on certain traditions, this desire to have a clear calendar now. And some of these traditions may be more or less credible. And some also may find the motivation to do the exact opposite of whatever tradition indicates or whatever a popular view might be, or to do what seems the most unique. It is clear that none of these approaches are fully useful in the seeking of the truth of the Torah and the seeking of the Torah calendar. Since I believe that things happen for a reason, and since I believe that Elohim is involved in what is going on as far as people returning to the Torah, personally I think this current situation is by design for some reason, though I do not wish to speculate about those reasons on this video. I believe that will eventually be sorted out, and the details regarding every aspect of the calendar will be made clear in the future, at least to those who choose to be receptive and choose to conform to it. And that may simply be through the reestablishing of the Ten a meeting or some other way in the future. However, despite that, we cannot forego our own seeking of truth, our own thorough study of the commands and of the text of the Torah, and we cannot forego our own spreading of awareness of the need to observe the Torah, just because of our own beliefs about what we hope happens in the near future. Each of us clearly still needs to do our part. One thing I have learned over the last 16 years is that it is easy to get wrapped up in defending the truth. While it makes sense to defend the truth, I believe that one must also be willing to continue seeking truth, because we may not have fully arrived at the 100% truth of everything yet, despite what our emotions may try to tell us or may have tried to tell us in the past. However, even though I believed that I had stopped holding emotional attachment to any particular calendar view a while back, I have also realized over the past year that certain other biases have kept me from being decisive about coming to a calendar view. I have had a bias of wanting to have community agreement. There are certain views which are unpopular, and sometimes those views are unpopular for a good reason, and sometimes they're unpopular for a less than good reason. Popularity, as we know, does not determine the truth, nor does unpopularity. But popularity may affect who is willing to associate with you. There are also certain views that I have felt uncomfortable with because of how other people seem to approach this topic. There are views that I associate with guesswork, with contrarianism, just being different for the sake of being different, with personal philosophy and what I would consider just overall bad reasoning. There are views which I personally have negative associations with. But as with any matter of truth and righteousness, there will always be people that come to it for quote-unquote bad reasons, or because of some sort of bad logic. But that doesn't make the underlying point wrong. There are people who act unreasonably or think illogically with every position that exists, and there will always be someone who thinks someone is being unreasonable even though that person is doing the right thing. I think those biases have led me to feel more confused than I should have about this subject. I think the feeling of confusion was partially a smokescreen created by part of my mind to keep me from going down one particular path. I think it is important that we recognize these possibilities, especially when we think they're irrelevant to us or could not possibly be there for us. And so, how might we approach the calendar? The scriptural Torah-based calendar is tricky in my opinion. There are only a few clear and explicit rules on it in the text. There are only a few commands that say outright, this is specifically how you do some certain part of the calendar. The rest of it is going to be derived ideally from the Hebrew words and phrases which are used, any Torah commands which may indirectly hint at details for the calendar, and also the narrative and the demonstration of the observance of time in the stories in the Pentateuch. In my view, that is what should take the most weight whenever we are looking at and considering what might be evidence. In the future, I intend to describe some of my findings and some of the patterns which I see within the text, and I intend to share the conclusions I have arrived at in a practical sense as a result. To be clear, I do not presume that I have necessarily arrived at the 100% truth of the matter, and I recognize that I am just piecing together what I can from the text and the language into something that I believe fits with the text. I intend to wait until after the festival season has closed for most people before the second part of the series, because I want to allow for the greatest possibility of openness on the subject, both for me as I am putting it together and for others as you may be listening.